So tonight we're going to talk about the 1812 invasion of Russia with Adam, and he was kind enough to join us. And let's jump right in. With the book and the research you've done, I wanted to talk about that year of 1812 because Napoleon makes that fateful decision to invade Russia. How did we get to this point when just 5 years earlier, Russia and France had made peace at the Treaty of Tilsit?
The problem was that the Treaty of Tilsit was a major mistake on both sides because, as Talleyrand pointed out, Napoleon's then foreign minister, he pointed out that Russia was not a natural ally for France because Russia had too many interests in Germany. First of all, her ruling family was half German and married into the various German families. Russia had an obsession with moving westwards into Europe and playing a role, and that the perfect strategic ally for France, for Napoleon, was in fact Austria, which also wanted to keep Russia out of Central Europe, essentially out of the German lands, which were weak and couldn't in those days defend themselves. He preferred to have Napoleonic hegemony over the German lands in Central Europe than Russian. Napoleon suddenly he went all poetic. He had these moments when he suddenly got these visions, which are rather romantic. And having met young Alexander, who was a personable fellow and quite silly, but very charming.
Right.
He suddenly thought that he was an attractive person to be allied to, as opposed to a boring old Austrian ex-emperor. And secondly, he thought he could dominate him, which at the beginning he did at Tilsit. He really wrapped him round his finger. And also behind it lay a sort of romantic idea that he was the emperor of the West and here was the emperor of the East. It sounded like a repeat of the old Roman Empire. And so at the same time, he managed to, it was a very odd thing, the Tilsit meeting, because on one hand, there was a great deal of cordiality and exchange. He gave the Legion of Honor to one of the bravest grenadiers, and Alexander responded, and so on. And actually, Alexander, who'd been completely trashed, I mean, his army had been completely trashed at Friedland,
right,
and before that at Austerlitz, of course. Instead of losing territory, he actually gained a bit of what had been Prussian Poland. But the moment he got back home, public opinion in Russia felt completely dissed. They were furious and they felt that humiliated by the fact that they'd lost Austerlitz, that they'd lost Friedland, and they blamed Alexander, quite rightly, because instead of staying at home, as most of his advisors suggested, he had an obsession with leading his army. And so the defeats were associated with him. And more to the point, one thing that he had committed to at Tilsit was to force Russia into the Napoleon's Continental System, to either bring Britain to the negotiating table with France or to close Russia's ports to it. And that's extremely unpopular in Russia because Britain was one of Russia's major trading partners, buying wood and hemp and all the things that they needed and grain. So Alexander found himself in an untenable position and very quickly realized he would have to fight back, and immediately, almost immediately, began rebuilding his army and developing his artillery and preparing for the next round.
Mm. Yeah, and just to summarize, Napoleon thought he could bring Britain to its knees with the Continental System by forbidding all trade with Britain in Europe. But, I mean, there are many ways around this Continental System, even in the countries that were dominated by France. I know Louis's brother in Holland was violating it. Italy was violating it. So it probably looked like a good idea to Napoleon on paper, but it just didn't work out that way.
Yes, and the other thing, of course, which was possibly even more important, was the fact that he had recreated a tiny Polish state. It wasn't called Poland.
Mm-hmm.
It was called the Grand Duchy of Warsaw. But it bothered the Russians because it suggested a resurgence of Poland. And of course, Russia had taken a huge amount of Polish territory in the past 50 years. And they were terrified that this Poland was going to start taking some of it back, or at least influencing Russia, because, of course, this Polish state was much freer than Russia and didn't have serfdom and so on. And this was an old Russian bugbear that Russian serfs kept running away to Poland, where they could become free.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I could see where that'd be problematic for Russia to have this free state just over the border that is a shining example to the serfs.
Yes, I mean, and Alexander kept asking Napoleon to make declarations that he would not allow the Poles to rebuild a Polish state.
Mm-hmm.
And Napoleon quite rightly said, look, first of all, I can't stop another country doing what it wants to do. Mm-hmm. And secondly, it would be dishonorable because the Poles have fought for me very well and they're nice people, and I'm not going to do this.
Right.
And this was really the major stumbling block. That's what negotiations broke down over.
Well, let's dive into the invasion itself. Many people often assume that the attacking army of Napoleon's was a French-only force, but it was comprised of soldiers from many nations, correct?
Yes. The French were the largest, but only by a fairly narrow margin. The next largest were the Poles, about 90,000 of them. Then there were Italians, various Germans, including Prussians, contributed. And Austrians. There were 30,000 Austrians, and there were even Portuguese and
amazing,
which is quite astonishing. So it was a mixed force, mm-hmm. And one of the fatal errors Napoleon made was to place the Austrians as an independent corps under Schwarzenberg on his right wing, where he couldn't control them, and the Prussians right up in the Baltic states, where they were kept in check by MacDonald, I think. but were also out of the main fighting. Whereas in fact he should have got them to bloody their noses at the main battles and kept his French, his loyal troops close to his chest, instead of which he bloodied probably amongst his most loyal were the Poles and the Italians.
Yeah.
And he bloodied them consistently.
Well, let's talk strategy on both sides. I've read that Napoleon's strategy was to get a quick knockout blow against the Russian army and force them to sue for peace. And on the Russian side, I know many generals, including Kutuzov and de Tolly, get credit for the battle plan, quote unquote, of luring Napoleon deeper and deeper into Russia. What do you think the goals of each side were?
Well, first of all, Napoleon wasn't a strategist. He was a brilliant tactician. Mm-hmm. And he didn't have a strategy. And this was the fundamental reason why the whole thing ended in disaster. He didn't want to invade Russia. What he wanted to do was to intimidate Alexander into coming along and agreeing to implement the Continental System. And therefore he collected this great army to frighten him, which it failed to do. And then, having arrived on the frontier, he had to cross. He couldn't then go home. Mm-hmm. So it was then that he decided, right, well, let's do a quick knockout blow. But by then it was already a bit late to implement a tactic like that. And then, having failed to do that, he had no strategy, no end game, no final. He kept hoping that Alexander would negotiate. As for Alexander, he did have a strategy. He had been building up an army on his western flank for at least a couple of years. He had been carrying on negotiations with people throughout Germany, with the Austrians, and with various Polish leaders. And the idea was that he would march into the Grand Duchy of Warsaw and into East Prussia. He would then raise a huge Polish army and get the Prussians, who loathed Napoleon, to join him, then sweep into Germany and, as it were, liberate Germany and then defeat Napoleon. And so that was his strategy, and he did carry it on.
Yeah, he did. He did, yeah.
And there was absolutely no plan to retreat at all. They had a huge supplies at Vilnius. And a retreating army doesn't bring forward huge supplies. No, they left in a panic without any plan at all. They meant to make stands at various points, but were always found that they didn't have time to take up positions, and were forced into this retreat. They'd always made grand statements about, you'll never be able to get us because we can always run away, which is perfectly true, but that wasn't the original plan at all.
Speaking of that, I guess the line in the sand was finally drawn at Smolensk, which is a holy city in Russia. And it was a seemingly hollow victory for Napoleon because the Russian army slipped away. And I'd like to discuss this battle and its ramifications, because I read that most of the army wanted to stop there in Smolensk. And I read Chief of Staff Berthier even broke out into tears when Napoleon decided to press on to Moscow. What happened in Smolensk? Why was this not a good battle for Napoleon?
Smolensk was ridiculous because the Russians made a stand. There was absolutely no point in capturing it. And what he should have done was what he did when finally they had to abandon it and started retreating. And he cut off their retreat to Moscow. Unfortunately, And he could have then absolutely blocked the Russian army and defeated it totally. Unfortunately, Junot, General Junot, who was commanding one of the corps, had one of his fits. He was gradually losing his mind. He had serious mental issues, and then later went completely mad and jumped out of a window and killed himself. And he had this. He was totally paralyzed, and his officers were saying, "Come on, come on, come on! We're right there."
Right.
And he just stood there in a complete trance and failed to close the trap. And Napoleon then found himself in a ridiculous position because he had by then lost at least a third of his army, mainly to disease, desertion, and the heat. What people forget is that a huge number of people died of heat stroke on the way in to Russia. People always think of them dying of cold on the way out, but it was tens of thousands died on the way in. And he'd lost an army. He had nothing to show for it. And he couldn't stop at Smolensk because it had been burnt out. It was just a charnel house. The only thing he could have done was to say, okay, that's it. This is the new boundary, and I'm recreating Poland as an ally.
Right.
But he didn't want to do that because he still wanted to reach an agreement with Alexander.
Yeah.
And he treated the whole Polish thing as a pawn in the game. Alexander was going to say, okay, you abolish the Grand Duchy of Warsaw and give me Poland, then I will join your Continental System against Britain. And he was prepared to do that. But what he wasn't, that wouldn't have worked if he'd then said, right, I'm recreating Poland in its old boundaries, which did include at one stage Smolensk. So he could have made a great point there. But he was caught up again. You see, he wasn't a strategist. He never was. He was a tactician.
Well, he makes the bold move, but dangerous decision to press on to Moscow. And again, the Russians retreat towards Moscow, and Borodino, which is quite a bloodbath, but it does secure the capture of Moscow for Napoleon. Why was this battle so particularly brutal?
Well, it was a frightful battle because, first of all, I suppose it was probably one of it's not that there were that many troops, because the French had probably about 125,000 and the Russians about 155,000. But they both had a large amount of artillery. Napoleon had about 550 guns. The Russians had about 600, nearly 650. And because it was the Russians that sort of entrenched themselves, rather than outflanking them in his old brilliant ways, Napoleon, who was anyway ill that day, just sat there and tried to sort of beat them to pulp head on. So both sides just cannonaded each other all day long. Napoleon incomprehensibly stupidly drew up what was left of his cavalry, and there was very little left. I mean, there was one cavalry division which had set out with 7,500 men and horses, was down to 1,000. And finally, how they managed to charge up that hill and capture the Grand Redoubt, God only knows, but they did. And it was a sort of battle of attrition. And the Russian soldier and this was most Western armies, if they saw they were outflanked or that one side was sort of winning, they would then retreat or in some cases just run away, because nobody wanted to die unless there was a point to it. Whereas the Russian soldier, their whole ethos was to stand and fight, and just stand and fight. In fact, Frederick the Great, I think, made a comment about the trouble about Russian soldiers is first you have to kill them, then you have to push them over, because they still stood.
Right.
And so it was a battle of attrition.
Yeah.
And Napoleon didn't, whereas he didn't maneuver at all. And when there was an opportunity, when suddenly their flank was opened, and Davout, amongst others, begged him to throw in his guard, which would have simply wrapped up the entire Russian army and possibly captured Kutuzov. He was afraid to commit that. He didn't want to use his last pawn.
Yeah, I read about that, and I keep going back and forth on if it was a good decision or a bad decision, because it was an elite unit. He did need them on his retreat out, as it proved. But should he have just thrown them in there? That's a good question.
Well, he didn't need them more than he needed other troops on his retreat. And anyway, he wasn't thinking in terms of his retreat. And things would have looked very different if he had managed to completely smash the Russian army there. By allowing Kutuzov to get away, it allowed Kutuzov, who was a great propagandist and a liar, to write a letter that evening to the Tsar saying that he'd won a great victory and had pursued the French for several miles before he himself retreated. He couldn't have done that. He wouldn't have been able to do that.
Yeah.
And keep the morale together at all.
Right.
Had the guard gone in.
Well, Napoleon's stay after capturing Moscow was not a pleasant one. First, a large part of the city was consumed by fire. And secondly, there were no peace offerings from Czar Alexander. And lastly, his supply lines were very overextended. Do you think he stayed too long in Moscow, or do you think he should have wintered there with his army?
He couldn't have wintered there successfully. He stayed far too long, and he was pig-headed. He didn't take the advice. Caulaincourt, who was the master of his horse, had been ambassador in St. Petersburg, and he said, "Look, the winter's coming. We should get out. And even if we don't get out, what we should do is, first of all, make gloves and shoe the horses properly with crampons." And all the Polish troops did exactly that. And that's why the light horsemen, the Polish light horsemen of his old guard, were the only ones who escorted him out of Russia in the end, because they could still, they still had kept their horses and could still charge on the ice. And Caulaincourt did it for Napoleon's horses and his carriage horses. Napoleon didn't give orders; he just poo-pooed everything. And had he left even 1 week earlier, he would have saved 10,000s of men and probably his reputation. If he'd left 2 weeks earlier, it wouldn't have been a disaster at all. And the other thing that he could have done, and originally they wanted to do, was having taken Moscow, which was, okay, it was a sort of symbolically a holy city, but it was the capital of the Russian Empire.
Right.
St. Petersburg was the capital.
Right.
And if he'd turned north, there was absolutely no Russian force between him and St. Petersburg. And he could have gone there, or else could have immediately marched south and smashed what was left of Kutuzov's army at Tarutino, where he was trying to reform the army. But he sat there, allowing Kutuzov time to reform an army. and by the time that Napoleon did move, Kutuzov had nearly 100,000 men under arms. They weren't properly trained and so on, but they were there. So he was. It was extraordinary. He was like a sort of rabbit caught in headlights. He just didn't seem to know what to do, and just hoped that somehow his lucky star, as he used to call it, would suddenly, that a sort of Deus ex machina would turn up.
He decides to retreat, I think, in October 1812. And as he's heading out, he has a stiff battle at the Battle of Maloroslavets, which doesn't get as much notoriety as Borodino, but this was a pivotal battle, correct?
Well, yes, it wasn't as big as Borodino.
No.
And it wasn't a sort of fixed battle. It took place, but because the first idea was that he was going to retreat by a different route, so as not to go through ravaged territory, because on the way in, his army had eaten everything there was to eat along the way in. So although the route was peppered with blockhouses with French garrisons, which was quite convenient, but there was absolutely no victuals along the way. So he marched out southwards and was going to take a different route and march towards Minsk, now the capital of Belarus, where there were large supplies and where he had a corps of his own troops waiting for him. But Kutuzov headed him off, and there was a really gruesome battle where the poor old Italians were absolutely brilliant, but there was sort of almost hand-to-hand fighting. And then in this little town, which was almost entirely built of wood, and which of course caught fire. And so, just to make it more gruesome, the dying and the wounded were sort of grilled half alive, and it really was. And when he rode over the battlefield, he won. The Russians retreated. But having seen the rest, he decided to turn back and retreat down the old road. And ironically, the Russians retreated as well. And so the two armies retreated from each other. And he went back to the old road, having wasted an extra 4 days and lost 6,000 men at least. And he'd lost his nerve because on the eve of Yaroslavets, he rode out to reconnaissance something and was nearly captured by some marauding Cossacks. And this rattled him. He sort of lost his mojo. He didn't really stop and think, now how am I going to do this in the way that the old Napoleon would have done? Thought of something brilliant. And it wasn't really until he reached the Berezina that suddenly the old brilliance came out.
Yeah, and let's talk about that. I mean, we'll get to Berezina in just a minute, but how some people respond to catastrophe, and no doubt the Grand Armée had catastrophe after a catastrophe, but how did the marshals and generals perform? I know some didn't do well in catastrophe, like Murat, Junot, MacDonald, and even the great Iron Marshal Davout. But others kind of rose to the occasion, like Marshal Ney, Saint-Cyr, and Prince Eugene. How do you think his generals and marshals did?
Well, they did as best they could, actually. Well, MacDonald didn't have much of a role because he was just with the Prussians up in the north, so he didn't really take part in it. Murat was his usual sort of flamboyant self, quite useless a lot of the time, but good. Ney showed extraordinary brilliance and courage and determination on the retreat, when he managed to dodge the Russians barring his road and make a detour and lead the remainder of his corps around, which was an extraordinary feat and magnificent. Davout did very well, but Napoleon didn't listen to him at Borodino. Eugene did well, as well as he could, and most of them did. The big problem was that down in the south, the ones on the way in who messed up were Davout, because he put them under the orders of his wretched, silly brother Jerome, who messed everything up, and so Davout and Poniatowski were completely thrown out of their calculations and failed to nab Bagration, who was one of the most inspirational Russian generals.
Indeed.
If not, and most of them were not particularly inspirational. I mean, they were a pretty mediocre lot. I mean, Barclay de Tolly was very good, but he was loathed by most of the people, particularly by Bagration. Kutuzov was a cunning old fox, but not a good general. And he loathed Bennigsen. They were not a brilliant lot. Some of the lower generals, Vitzingerode, and then the lower ranks, people like Davidov, commanding those partisan units, they were good. But most of the generals were pretty useless. And Kutuzov could have captured Napoleon if he'd tried to, but he didn't. He wanted, whether he was slightly afraid, which is very possible, or whether he, there was a theory that he believed that Napoleon should be given a golden bridge out of Russia because he was afraid that if Napoleon were defeated, the British would become Russia's major enemy. And he was not the only one who thought that way and thought, better to have a strong France with Napoleon because otherwise you'd have Britain and the Prussians and the Germans would all get above themselves.
As we touched on earlier, the bridge over the Berezina, I think, is probably the most remarkable accomplishment of the whole invasion. I don't think the Dutch engineers and French General Eble get enough credit for what they did in that horrible environment. I mean, what do you think of this whole scene? Because usually that river's frozen. Of course, by chance, it wasn't frozen. So they had to build a bridge.
And there were great big ice flows, blocks of ice floating down it with quite a strong current. And it wasn't very nice to be hit by a sort of half a ton chunk of ice.
No.
Yes, one should mention the Belgians, because one always says the Dutch, but the Dutch and the Belgians were the ones who got into the water. And it was an extraordinary feat, both of engineering and of improvisations, because they had to, they set up smithies in order to turn any metal they could find into braces and nails and things. And they and the other thing was that once they'd got across, what was brilliant on Napoleon's part was that he suddenly got news from some cavalry that was coming up that there was a crossing point, a shallow place up in north of Borisov where the bridge had been cut. And so what he did was put a rumor apart that he was going to move south and cross to the south. And he made a sort of demonstration of moving south. And so the Russians on the other side of the river, Admiral Cheshagov, all scuttled down southwards to prevent him there, while he moved north and started building this bridge in the middle of the night.
Yeah.
And the more remarkable thing was that the first troops he pushed across then took up positions to stop the returning Russians from occupying the bank, because once they'd realized that he hadn't moved south, the Russians came marching up as fast as they could to head him off there. Concerted effort, and this shows the solidity of the Napoleonic Empire and the Napoleonic military machine, because the bridge was built by Dutch and Belgian troops, and the other side was defended all day long at immense cost by Italian, Polish, and Swiss troops, who got absolutely massacred in the process, but meant that all the people having crossed the bridge could carry on and move on without being bothered on the other side. It's remarkable how in those unspeakable conditions, at a moment where everybody realized the whole game was over, and yet the whole thing worked, the discipline worked in so many places, and a lot of people deserted or just fell by the wayside or gave up, but a nucleus of almost every corps remained solid, and that says a lot about his sort of inspirational qualities and the actual way the Imperial Army was constructed.
Yeah, it's just a fascinating feat, and so it's just a good example of the sacrifice of a few saving the many. And because I know a lot of those Belgians and Dutch engineers died in that river, and then as soon as they built the river and most of the army got across, they had to burn it, which it's just amazing. However, once Napoleon realizes that his army is for the most part safe on the retreat, he leaves the army in a sledge to return to France. Was this the right decision?
It was, because what he needed to do was to show the world that he was still in control on the throne in France, to rally French opinion, and to raise a new army to come out and stabilize the situation. What he got wrong was to place Murat in charge. What everybody, including Berthier, suggested was putting Prince Eugène de Beauharnais in charge. They could have held Vilnius as it now is. There was no problem there. But Murat's nerve, he was already fed up. His nerve failed him, and he just thought he just couldn't be bothered. Whereas if he'd left Prince Eugène there, there would have been a chance that they could have defended it. The Russians, let's not remember, they also suffered the most terrible losses during, following Napoleon out of Russia.
Oh yeah.
Every time there was even a skirmish, the French won. The Russians were beaten and took heavy casualties, and so they were completely at the end of their tether. And had the French just put up a defense at Vilnius, that would have stopped it, and they could have well have held there. They had enough supplies to hold out there, and that was the big problem. But his decision to return was right, and indeed he, within no time at all, he did raise a new army and was able to sally forth and win two very impressive victories in Saxony. And if Vilnius had held, then the Polish corps would have held at Warsaw, and so would the Saxons. And so he wouldn't have had to fight in Saxony. That army would have come back into the Grand Duchy, and it would have been a very different outcome.
Right. Well, let's talk aftermath. The numbers are debatable, but it seems out of 600,000 troops, only 100,000 of Napoleon's soldiers ever made it out of Russia. The Russians themselves suffered about 250,000 men lost. What do you think the legacy is of this ill-fated invasion?
Well, first of all these figures are pretty much guesswork.
Yeah.
It's probable that between the 24th of June, 1812, when Napoleon crossed the Niemen, and December 1812, when he recrossed the Niemen, that between 550 and 600,000 Allied military crossed into Russia. Also, probably about 50,000 civilian commissaries and bureaucrats. But bear in mind that, first of all, in the first couple of weeks, about 50,000 deserted, and they deserted out of Russia.
Smart move. Yeah.
Secondly, probably about 30,000 were sent back either as wounded or as cadres to form up new recruits. It's not at all sure how many actually crossed in June. About 120,000 came out in December, and the Russians took about 100,000 prisoners. Mm-hmm. The trouble was that the ones who came out, of the 120,000, 30,000 were Austrian and about 20,000 were Prussian, and quite a lot were Poles who survived very well because they had made themselves gloves and shod their horses. And so it's impossible to really estimate how many people lost. I think one can probably say that around 400,000 of the Allied troops did lose their lives, of which less than probably about a quarter of them in battle. The rest out of disease, cold, heat, whatever. Yeah. The Russians also lost about 400,000 in dead. And again, a tiny proportion in battle. Yeah. But a huge number of Russian non-combatants were killed. And also Russia lost people because with the chaos going on, an awful lot, huge numbers of serfs ran away westwards. The perfect opportunity. And the censuses made by the Russians of fleeing, of the peasants who fled, are really quite impressive in the following year. So figures are always very, very difficult to arrive at. I mean, all military figures are always very tricky. But
I just wonder if he had not invaded Russia, if he would have kept his throne.
He had to do something because Russia was massing an army and about to invade Central Europe. Mm-hmm. What he could have done was just moved a lot of troops into Germany and beefed up his presence in the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, and waited till the Russians made a move, or indeed, made some other clever arrangement. But the trouble was, you see, he was hampered by the fact that he didn't have a strategy. It's no good going to war without a fundamental war aim, as we have seen in the last 20 or so years.
Yeah.
You don't have a specific goal you're trying to achieve and an end game, then it's bound to fail. So he couldn't do nothing. And indeed, one Russian historian, a sensible Russian historian, writing at the beginning of the 20th century, actually put it that Napoleon had to invade in self-defense.
Yeah.
The only thing is that he should have invaded with a plan, i.e., either to destroy the Russian Empire by raising a huge revolution amongst the serfs, or else by recreating the Kingdom of Poland, and or else just going for St. Petersburg, or telling the Prussians, okay, you can repossess the Baltic states, which were entirely manned by Germans.
Right.
There are various options. Send Murat into Ukraine and create a great Cossack nation. They loved him. The Cossacks loved Murat.
They did.
Because of his extravagant behavior. I mean, there were all sorts of things he could have done.
Yeah.
He had to do something, and he did the worst possible thing.
Yeah, and it probably didn't help. He was fighting a two-front war with Spain and Portugal and the British. So maybe if he would have wrapped that up first. Yeah, you just wonder like how he could have better strategized this operation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, as I always say, Napoleon was a fantastic tactician, but he was no strategist.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just a fascinating study. And if you'd like to learn more, I recommend Adam's book, 1812, Napoleon's Fatal March on Moscow. Really good stuff in there. And I thank you for joining us. This was great.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for coming on the show. And again, adamzamoyski.com if you'd like to learn more about the author. And yeah, we're happy to have him on the show. Thank you, Adam.